Hello. Welcome to our third session on postcolonial studies. I hope you all are doing well and would be contributing to today's discussion. Now, as you might already know, as I had announced, today's topic is our discussion of McClintock's essay, The Angel of Progress, Pitfalls of the Term Postcolonialism. Now, as I had mentioned in my previous lectures, I've included these three critical essays of postcolonialism from the time period when the field is just emerging. So this essay was published also in 1991 in a special issue of Social Text. And as we read it, there are some really interesting insights in it, but we also need to also then learn from it what were the anxieties, scholarly and social, that the term postcolonial was, invoking from its very start and normalization in the academy? And have we as postcolonialists overcome some of these criticisms and some of these anxieties? So that's why I've included these critical essays, because if you want to specialize in a field, you don't just learn what it is about, you also want to know, how was it being critiqued and how is it being critiqued. So that's what we'll be talking about. And so, I'll start the conversation and then see what kind of questions you have. Now, the first interesting thing is the title itself, right? The Angel of Progress. And there is, of course, a quotation from Walter Benjamin in the beginning. Now, that comes from, if you look on the screen, this painting, not necessarily a painting, a sketch that Walter Benjamin had bought and fell in love with, and he carried it everywhere. He would put it in every apartment that he owned or rented. And then quite a number of times in his writings, Benjamin reflects on this image of the angel, right? And the quote is from one of the essays that was posthumously published, right? And that essay kind of also scandalized the Marxist intellectual world, because it was kind of in some kind of an opposition to dialectical materialism and the progress of dialectical materialism. So, if you think of it in this way, the movement in Marxist teleological movement of history is always from past to the present. So one mode of production creates certain kind of consciousnesses. That mode of production is altered, new consciousnesses emerge until we reach the final stage of the proletariat, overthrowing the bourgeois and creating a revolutionary world, right? But what he is saying is, and I'll read the quote and then unpack it. What he is saying is, his face is turned towards the past. Okay, look at the angel. This is what he's talking about. The angel would like to stay awaken, awaken the dead and make whole that which has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Now, keep this in mind, that the angel's back is turned towards the future. Now, the teleological movement of Marxist utopia is that your face has to be turned towards future, right? But no, the angel's back is turned towards the future, but the angel is facing the past. And from that, one insight that people get is, which is crucial to postcolonial theory, but others as well, is that we must learn from our past, retrieve it, and then join the inexorable march of progress. And that's where she will leave us at the end, that maybe it creates a space in Marxist thought, but also in other thought, to dwell on the past, right, to change the future. But that change of progress over time is inexorable. It's constantly there. That's the one technical reference in the beginning of the essay. The second reference is to the 1991 exhibition, which was called the Hybrid Space Exhibition. And there were several kinds of exhibitions, but the one that she is referring to here is this hybrid space exhibition on Broadway, which was called Parallel History, right? And in this exhibition, an actual space was created. You crawled through one part, which was prehistoric past, then you entered the middle, which was the colonial period, then you broke through that into a wider area, which was called the hybrid space. And then, as you exited the exhibit, you went backwards, right? And what the reason she's using these two examples is what she's saying is that the hybrid history exhibit, while giving us this space of hybridity where the post-colonial is supposed to be living, fixes us to the linearity of time, right? To this idea that we start somewhere and then colonialism happens, then we break through it and create a world, teleologically speaking, where all cultures and histories, so the idea of this multiple histories, but its progression comes through one single line of time. And those are some of her critiques of postcolonialism. The term postcolonialism, what she's talking about, is problematic, and she's reading the term in terms of suggesting that it is a prepositional term. It is a post-colonialism term. It presupposes that we have entered the phase of post-colonialism, and that what the term does is it gives one temporality to all colonial experiences, one, and two, it anchors the study of all these disparate cultures from all over the world to a European time, which is the time of colonialism, right? So that's the second critique, right? And third critique in this essay is, remember, she's reading one of the first books that was available at that time by Helen Tiffin and Bill Ashcroft, which was called The Empire Writes Back. And in that book, the authors don't make a distinction between settler colonialism and what was called the occupational colonialism. They just, this is the book. It was published by Routledge, The Empire Writes Back. And I remember when I was writing my master's thesis, I asked my, advisor to tell me of some books about post-colonialism, and this is the book that she had recommended. Now, the book was published in 1989. And it was, in a way, the first book that dealt with the issues of post-colonialities and tried to define it. But as you read this book, you will realize that they lump United States, New Zealand, Canada, Australia also into their literatures become post-colonial too. And that is one of the biggest critiques. The last part of the essay is, okay, here you've included United States into the post-colonial nations, but most of the destruction wrought in the world until 1991, remember? The 1991 was crucial also because it's the year of the fall of the Soviet Union and invasion of Afghanistan and rise of United States as the only dominant military power. So then most of the second part of the essay is a critique of the world that was created post-war, right? And what are the ramifications of including these most powerful countries also as post-colonial countries? So that is the progression of the essay, the connecting of, even though these are disparate histories, to one centralized European time, then also already defies the very claims of post-colonial studies, which want to retrieve multiple histories, right? And then she also talks about how post-coloniality, if we imagine it as one monolithic thing at one monolithic experience, it takes away the particularities of different kinds of colonialism that did happen, and then the internal colonialisms that are still in progress, the occupation of West Bank and Gaza still, but also at that time, the occupation of East Timor, right? The occupation of Tibet by China. All of these colonialisms were still operative. The South African intervention into Mozambique, the Rhodesian or Zimbabwean intervention in there, all of these occupations, post-colonialism cannot really account for it if we read the post as colonialism is over, right? That's her point. Then another big issue is the issue of gender, right? She also reads this post-war order, the order of progress through development, which America installs and initiates, as a men's world. And post-colonial theory, in a way, is also privileging male experiences, and not accounting for what happens to women even when colonialism ends, how pretty much most of the post-colonial nation states become patriarchal, right? And the men of those nations become part of the international power structures, right? So the masculinity of the experience, the linearity of time and its connection to European single time, and not accounting for the varied and different kinds of colonial experiences that every country, every post-colonial nation had, but also the actually existing colonialisms. These are some of the criticisms of post-colonial theory that she is mobilizing. And then what is the danger of believing in this teleological movement of progress? If post-colonialism is a progress of theory, at what cost, right? What is being forgotten and what is not being taken into account? These are some of her critiques in 1991. The question for us now is, has post-colonialism as a field complicated this picture? Has it been broadened, right, in any way? I would say yes. I mean, we have come a long way from that, right? From that way of thinking. But do keep in mind that people who are opposed to post-colonial studies, maybe for not such deep philosophical reasons, but simply just because they don't like people like me in the academy constantly, because we are also sadly placed in the English departments, right? So English departments tend to be deeply conservative about the canon. And here are we coming along and basically suggesting that we shouldn't even be an English department. We should be a department of literature in English, and challenging the very assumptions of modernism and Shakespeare and all that. So this is something that people like that often mobilize to beat us over our head, that, oh, this is what you do, and we have to point to them that, hey, guys, this is 1991. The field hasn't even emerged yet. We have people who do all these kind of disparate things and account for American imperialism and, British imperialism, but also internal colonialisms. And we have scholars who talk about women's rights and gender and how do they figure in the post-colonial nation states. So, but as an early debate, this was a very instructive debate, as the field of post-colonial studies was emerging in the American Academy. And when we read Ella Shoat, then we would have read 3 critical articles. We read, of course, Arif Dirlik, whose critique was basically on the culturalist aspects of post-coloniality and the role of intellectuals, Indian intellectuals, but others who kind of create the post-colonial field in their own image. This one is a further critique of the danger of assuming that the post is a stable temporal marker, assuming that coloniality has ended, and connecting all the experience of 85% of the globe to this one singular experience of colonialism, which connects their histories to European time, and thus postcolonialism defeats its own purpose because it is, despite the fact that it is saying we are going to go and experience multiple histories, it connects all those histories to one single European time. So these are some of my views on this. And maybe see one other thing that you can really use this essay good for, and it has really great research, is just the amount of statistical detail that she gives you about the US aggressions in South America, elsewhere in the world, and also just the activities, post-war activities. What was the cost of US order, right, in the world? How was it enforced through World Bank, through IMF? There is a great a few passages about the debt trap of African nations as well as the Asian nations. And as we progress forward, as we add more materials, since part of my own specialization is neoliberalism and globalization, we'll bring in a couple of theorists from that also who talk about these post-colonial issues. But while you're coming up with your questions, I would like to talk about what she talks about, the order, the economic order that America launches. Right now, it was in competition with another order, which was the Soviet Union system, but both were in one way or the other economic systems. Right? By 1991, Soviet Union is defeated and capitalism in a way is triumphant, and she refers to the Francis Fukuyama book, which was a huge book when it came out, because it was called End of History. According to Fukuyama, history had ended and its end was capitalism and liberal democracy. And now we have seen that even Fukuyama agreed that was kind of true triumphant at that time. And his tone was true triumphal. But that was the moment when this is being written. This is like the most significant moment in the world history. Suddenly, after the invasion of Iraq, right? What she's calling the second Gulf War, we call it the first Gulf War, right? Is when one order has emerged as the dominant order, and that is the capitalistic system. And when it emerges, what kind of a world is created? Like the World Bank initiatives that she talks about, all these developmental initiatives which are poisonous and destructive to the environment, right? Now in hindsight, we know that they were destructive, right? But at that time, progress was being offered, and progress in that sense, as Walter Benjamin sees, is that it unleashes its own destructions, and maybe it is inevitable, right? Now, in hindsight, we realize that no, development can be done in a different way. But think of it this way, the developing nations, which we call the post-colonial nations, they are still caught in this debt trap, which they went in 1970. And if you look at the budget of every nation, other than the dominant 7 or 8 nations, the first line on their budget is always debt servicing. This is the interest that they need to pay to IMF. That's the kind of world in which we live in, that majority of the populations of the world are working, paying their taxes so their governments can pay a huge sum every year to IMF in interest, not in principal payment. And so where does that money go? To the most developed part of the world, which doesn't even need it. So this clientele, this comprador status is not an accident. It's maintained through policies, right? Through global dictates. I mean, think of the IMF's power, right? It can make or break a nation. If they withhold their loan to you, not only is that you will run out of cash, your economy will be destroyed, because the moment IMF says we are not renewing your loan, your debts are due, your market will crash, right? You will lose your credit lines in the world. How does a government work, right? And when you lose your credit lines, no, you can't do trade with anyone. If you don't have foreign reserves, you can't even buy things that people take for granted from the world, right? So since the global economy is so integrated and depends on your foreign exchange reserves and your access to credit, the moment that is threatened, the country collapses. It doesn't matter how hardworking those people are, right? That is the system that she is talking about. That is the So as scholars of postcolonialism, we can't just talk about this poem is radical and it challenges the hierarchy. No, we need to understand how the world works, right? And I'm happy to report that a lot of us who do postcolonial studies, absolutely, if we don't know how the world works, we are constantly looking for how the world works, right? And we have come a long way from there. The question of women, that is immensely important. And it has been answered by people like Laila Abu Lugha, Chandra Mohanty, Mariam Cook, all these other people. But there is something that happens in the colonial fight. In most of the times, unless they were Marxists, then they were talking about at least a modern capitalistic movement of mobilizing the people. The movements, anti-colonial movements, mostly relied on pre-colonial historical narratives to articulate who they were. And that reinstituted the gender hierarchies, right? And when the nation becomes independent, those gender hierarchies that were mobilized to retrieve a past culture then become the defining instances of it. So think of countries like Algeria, countries like Pakistan, right? Algerians, of course, fought hard and lost millions of people, right? Women were active participants in that fight. But after the independence, figure of the woman became this sacred woman who must wear hijab and all that. So women are then reinscribed into the private sphere. In Pakistan, we are constantly trying to do that. So sometimes post-colonialism becomes this tool for the powerful patriarchies, because if we are going to jettison everything Western, we must then go and retrieve something that we can call our own. Then people who have the discursive power and material power go and retrieve the most conservative gender divides, right? And then as a result, we end up creating either non-democratic countries because we are retrieving a tradition which was undemocratic, right, and valorizing it. And the writ of reactionary power is always written on the bodies of women, right? Because the breaking point of the world of modernity was when women enter the public sphere as equals, right? So that then becomes a fight within the post-colonial nation states. My point is, at this point, postcolonialism is part of that fight. The scholars who do postcolonial studies will challenge the gender hierarchies, will talk about it, will write about it, and will work towards taking whatever is redeemable from the West and nativizing it, but also fighting against any form of blatant nativism. So these are some of the things that the field itself has already, emerged in the field and are established in the field. I have one question that's showing up over here on my phone, and that is from Ray. Welcome, Ray. What books would you recommend to understand more on critical theory and concepts in sociology to understand the current situations in different countries in the world? That's a really good question. I am not sure about sociology, but there is a video on my YouTube channel about 3 of my favorite books on globalization. There is a blog post on my website on 5 of my favorite books on globalization and neoliberalism. I would highly recommend those. I would highly recommend reading David Harvey, okay, and his work on capitalism. Then for understanding the global system, there's a wonderful book by Noam Chomsky, a collection of his essays called Pirates and Emperors. Just look it up and read it, because that gives this understanding of how Unequal Global Relationships Work. Another book of Chomsky is Profit Over People. That also talks about especially the experimentation, the early experimentation of what we call the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism in South America. If you want to understand like the contemporary by Naomi Klein, this was one of the groundbreaking books, No Logo. This is a study of, and it is written for a popular audience, of how global corporations work. This is her new book, No Is Not Enough. I haven't yet read it, but it's getting a lot of attention. She has another book called The Shock Doctrine. So you read the classical sources, you read your Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, you read your Marx, right? So that you understand these two different ways of looking at economy and political economy. And then just the contemporary research on that. You can read it from the right, Milton Friedman and others, and you can read it from the left, even if you just do a search on Google, 10 most important books on neoliberalism, these people will come up. But what I'll do is I'll probably maybe either record another video with my recommendations or at least post a blog on my website with my recommendations. I am doing my thesis on gender trouble, but I attended your session in GC, and from that day interested in you. I've read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Good. So yeah, Gender Trouble is a great book, and an essay also. But we are so far away from there now in terms of gender theory. And sadly, that is the weakest point of mine in literary theory, because I haven't read many scholars, even though my mentor, Robin Goodman, is one of the leading feminist scholars. I mean, I've read her work, and I highly recommend it if you want to read about the political aspects of the gender fight, right? The feminism and the public sphere. So here in Pakistan, there has been a tendency to lump all the Anglophone writing together and then use postcolonialism as a, I mean, there is those kind of reductions happen everywhere. One thing you cannot do in postcolonial studies is to create monolithic ways of looking at things. Even when you are writing a very precise essay or something, you have to be very specific. That is what I teach my students. Don't make huge generalized claims. Another thing that is happening in Pakistan is that somehow there's a lot of emphasis on decolonial thought, which comes from, of course, from Walter Minvolo's work. But what people don't realize is that when Minvolo is imagining a non-Western system of reason, right, and living, he can go to a South American idyllic way of living with nature. But the danger in that retrieval is that depending on where you are, what will you go and retrieve? In Pakistan, it ends up being a religious retrieval, which is all good. But no one single retrieval of history or religion can save the world and can create justice in the world, right? That's why even though like hybridity is a difficult topic for me to still understand, a hybrid system of thought. So how do we challenge the West? We work in their academies. Does that mean we are incorporated? Yes, probably, because we have to follow the rules. But we challenge the Western episteme by constantly adding new knowledges to it, right? By using the vocabularies of the West, but infusing it with other ways of looking at things. I always find that to be a better approach. I don't even know what postcolonialism means in Pakistan, because it can be sometimes the most, unenlightened nativist way of looking at things. Some of them that I have encountered. there are writers who themselves have clearly distanced themselves from this label, discarding it as not such a useful term to refer to the concern. Yeah, I mean, the Bharti Mukherjee famously said, "I'm not a post-colonial author." There are some Pakistani authors who think so. The thing is, I don't care what the authors say. If I am a scholar of post-colonial studies and I pick up your work and say this is a post-colonial work and I'm going to read it, that's my prerogative. No one really cares what the author says. Why should it even matter? If the author wanted the work to be what he or she wants it to be, right? They should have kept it to themselves. The moment you throw it out in the public sphere, right, it's our work, right? We make it what we want to make it for as long as we do justice to the text. So I absolutely disagree with that assumption that so-and-so says I'm not a Pakistani author. That was an argument that was offered to me when someone stupid from Pakistan, and I apologize for that, misused one of my writings in a newspaper. And when I emailed this person, he told me, well, Mohsen Hamid doesn't even consider himself a Pakistani. Fine, right? He doesn't consider himself a Pakistani author, but when he was asked to contribute an essay, a short story to the Granta's issue of Pakistani writing in English, why did he do that if he doesn't consider himself a because he got a chance at publishing in Granta, right? So these are some of the arguments that people make. I really don't care personally as a scholar what the author says. I would never even care if they said, no, this is not what I meant. Because as a scholar, it's my job is to read the text from a situated position with a fair degree of honesty, right? And deference to the truth, but with no concern about what the author claims or not claims about the work. That is not my job and shouldn't be your job as an author, as a critic. Thank you so much, Ray. And if you keep joining us, then we'll keep learning from each other. Okay, Hina. Well, depending on what your interest is, if you go to my website and go to Postcolonial resources, right at the bottom of it is a whole list of books that my PhD students read. Okay, there are like 150 or 200 books that they have to read for their before they take their comprehensive exams. So that's a good place to start. And then if you message me about what specific area, then even if I don't know much about it, I can ask my colleagues for a list of books and post them. What would you say about neocolonialism and gender? How is this field of study? Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. I don't call it neo-colonialism, I call it neo-imperialism, because most of the times it's not necessarily an occupation, but it's ideological and discursive occupation. And within that, you can read how gender works, right? How women's rights work, how sexuality works. All you do is you don't always need a specific theorization of a specific place. You use theory and then you bend it to your use, right? So and so says this about gender. How does it apply in these three novels, from Pakistan? What happens to rights of women? And this constant argument from different, it's happening in India as well as in Pakistan. In India, the fundamentalist Hindus are now telling women what constitutes a good Hindu woman. In Pakistan, for the last 40 years, we've been trying to impose on women what constitutes being, proper womanhood. And the sad thing about the Islamic scholars is that they haven't even read their own works and they have silenced them. If you go, when my forthcoming book comes out, there is one chapter that deals with Fatima Marnisi's Women and Islam, and one chapter that part of that chapter also deals with the 1898 book by Maulana Mumtaz Ali, which was called Hukuk-e-Niswa. And in that book, he had pretty much very clearly destroyed all the religious argument about inequality of women, that is probably why our ulama and scholars don't cite Maulana Mumtaz Ali, because it dismantles their gendered hierarchy. But the problem with Pakistan isn't just that there aren't enough materials. The problem with Pakistan, in my opinion, is that the public sphere is so constricted through threats of violence, through legal actions, that people are not even permitted to think certain things. And you can't build a viable culture out of that. This is like, how do you make sure that you produce a complicated reading? Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what a complicated reading is. I mean, a good reading of any text takes into account, of course, as best as possible, what the text is saying. And then you have to be fair as a scholar. You have to be aware of your own politics, right? But you have to state them outrightly. This is where I come from to this text. And a good reading would be fair in a sense that it doesn't, if it is challenging stereotypes, it doesn't mobilize a stereotype. And fair to the author, to the text, but also very open about where are you coming from and why. Always, you know, explain your theory. Why are you using Baba? Why are you using Spivak? What does she do for you in understanding this text? Why not someone else? And that would be a more complicated reading. I wouldn't call it complicated. I will say that would be a more balanced and sophisticated reading of any text. Do we need post-colonial studies? I don't care if you don't need it. I mean, I do it, I use it because it's my area of specialization. I got a PhD in it, right? What does it enable me to do? It enables me to, first of all, learn so many different strains of knowledge. How do you become a post-colonialist? You don't just read 10 books and take an exam. No, you go and read your Marx, right? Because you have to know what Marx said about capital. You read the entire history of critical theory, all the major theorists, because how will you know you are saying something new? How do you get to the edge of theory unless you have read it all? You go and read almost all the books that are produced in your field, right? So for me, why do I need it? Because that's my area of specialization. If you're not specializing in it, I think you can live a wonderful life without it. I mean, I always tell my students, you don't even need to read a single book to be a good human being. Okay, how many of you are from that part of Pakistan where your parents or your grandparents were completely unlettered, right? My mother could not read and write, but she was one of the most decent human beings I've ever known. So my idea is that you absolutely don't need to read anything to be a good human being. But if you are living in today's world and want to think about it critically, if you want to know what your place is in this world is this a just world, right? If it is not a just world, how do we make it better, right? Then post-colonial theory can help you understand those issues, right? Okay, so yes, I understand that there is a lot of pressure on men to maintain their masculinity, but I don't buy that. If you are manly, coming from a man, if you are manly enough and consider yourself a strong man, why would you care if you are nice to you? If someone says, hey, you're being too good to your wife and you're too soft to your children. I mean, isn't being a strong man means that you can take any criticism? But that pressure of masculinity isn't just pertinent to Pakistan. It happens over here too. Like same men, when they are amongst the company of their male peers, they behave differently because they try to maintain this aura of masculinity. And then when they are amongst women or amongst someone else, they are soft, they are nice, they are good. Um, so my idea is that I would basically blame men. I will never blame women for inviting any kind of aggression. Um, if a group of men accosts a single woman or a group of them, it's not the women's fault. It's their fault. I don't care how those women are dressed, what they are wearing. It has absolutely no value. The conduct of a male group or individual pointing a finger at a woman in the public sphere is absolutely the male's responsibility, right? And we should never blame the woman for it. I mean, that's where I stand. That's a good point, but I don't know how to explain how to do post-colonial criticism. There is no single way of doing it. If you watch some of my videos, read some of my articles, read someone else who's a post-colonialist, that is the way of doing it. I mean, if I tried to explain it, I have 7 post-colonial authors sitting over here. Edward Said's method is completely different. Gayatri Spivak is a deconstructionist. Homi Bhabha, I don't even know what he does. Fanon, right? Robert Young. So there is no single way of doing post-colonial scholarship. There are certain tropes that we use, right? Issues of gender, issues of class, issues of equity, issues of colonial influence on psyche of the colonized. You can pick and choose. Theory will enable you to articulate you better, but also make you privy to the debates. That's all any post-colonialist scholar can teach you. Beyond that, it will be up to you to choose which angle do you want to use to develop your scholarly work. Think of it this way. I have a student who is taking her exams as a post-colonialism PhD next month. She has read so far about 280 books which were on her list, right? She has spent a year and a half reading those books. Those are all different kinds of canonical post-colonial studies books, new books. But the purpose of that is for her to develop over 1.5 years enough reading in breadth to know her field of study, to know its major debates, and then find out from within those where does she stand, right? Now she'll go and take 3 exams on it, each one of them 4 hours. So that's 12 hours of exams, then 2 hours of oral defense. So by the time she has finished her exams, she has read her field, right? 280 books. Then she will go to her dissertation. So that is how you develop what kind of a post-colonialist you will be. 1 lecture is not going to do that for you. 2 lectures are not going to do that for you. It has to be a commitment. That is why people specialize on it. Now, I understand that in Pakistan and India, the exams are done differently, right? They give you the questions and say, here, bring us the answers. No, I mean, I'm not saying we do it better, but I'm saying our students have to register for exams and read. At least my students read at least 280, 250 books. We don't even count the articles they have to read, but I'm talking about books. So that's when you develop what you're going to be as a scholar, as a post-colonialist. And then over time, as you read more, new books come out, then you keep fine-tuning, what you want to do, what you want to develop. And by the way, there is a recorded session available on post-colonialism, about 1 hour and 10 minutes on on the channel, and you can always watch it because that's about the field itself, right? Okay, Avi, I enjoyed dropping in on this. Thank you for sharing it. I'm a PhD student in language and literacies for great social transformation with an interest. Do you make distinction between? That's a really good question. So personally, I don't. Because I think a lot of what Walter Minvolo is suggesting postcolonialists are already doing. All of these peoples go, and Walter Manvolo, I love his work. He actually came and taught a class for me when he visited our campus and met my undergraduate students. He's a wonderful scholar. I've used his work. But my point is that what he's suggesting as decolonialism or decolonial thinking presupposes that postcolonial scholars are so deeply incorporated within the logic of the vocabularies of metropolitan cultures that they cannot think beyond that. But there is not even a single one of the major postcolonialism scholars who has not, in one way or the other, incorporated knowledges from their native colonized countries or have tried to challenge the knowledge of the metropolitan academy. Now, decoloniality as a project of replacing Western reason with other forms of reason is an amazing concept. But it has its pitfalls. And what are those pitfalls? In order to replace Western reason, right, with this intent that this is too contaminated, too instrumental, too connected to the interests of the empire, where will you go? You will go into your native cosmologies, right? Now, for Manvolo, it's really convenient because he can go into an environmental and pacifist cosmology, the concept of the Panchamama and others, right? But think of India. There is a whole field emerging which is called Dharma studies, right? So what is that cosmology? Totally in opposition to Western reason. But when you get into it, what comes out? Yeah, maybe Hindu pacifism, right? But what else does it throw back at us? The hardening of the caste boundaries, right? The emergence of this idea that caste is immutable and we should take pride in it. What was the project of dismantling the caste? Part of it was started because of the intrusion of Western reason, right? Then the local scholars, B.R. Ambedkar, others, and the Buddhists, they came against it, right? No, but when you go into Dharma studies, it enables a different mode of thinking, absolutely. Or maybe a different mode of thinking the world, fine, but that still is within the confines of a system which has its own inherent problems. And they have started manifesting themselves in Indian politics, right? How would women behave in it? You go to any Islamic country, Muslim country where Islamists are vocal and in power, right? What have they done? If you dismantle any knowledge that complicates your own episteme and go and you will retrieve the most purest form of a cosmology, and along with it will come the pre-modern ways of looking at world, the pre-modern ways of looking at women, their role in the world. So in the end, that kind of decoloniality then ends up creating a monstrosity in itself. So my place, Avi, on that then is, and I've always held that view, is that thought should be open and we should measure everything against everything and say, my yardstick is this enables more people, this makes a more equitable world, this makes a more caring and compassionate world. Now, I know I'm being a consequentialist here, right? But if it does that, I will take it. I don't care where that thought comes from. That's why I've never been able to be a pure Marxist or a pure culturalist or a pure Muslim, right? Or anything else. Because my idea is, here are some core things that I believe in. Human dignity, equality of access to the world's resources, right? Respect for each other, respect for my privacy, or I don't care who you are, gay, lesbian, transgender, giving you the human dignity that you deserve from me and taking that from you. These are some of the loose principles which Eagleton would say we can universally somewhat agree on, right? If someone comes to me and says it's not allowed in my religion, I would say, thank you so much. I don't want to follow that religion. So beyond that, I think decolonial theory, one good thing that it does is that it puts the self-centering of Western reason and Western philosophy under challenge, right? So that we don't take it ipso facto and say, this is the real way of thinking it. Beyond that, you run into problems. So I think post-colonial theory, post-colonial scholars, somewhat one way or the other, have already been doing decolonial work and can constantly keep on doing that. Sorry, it was a very long answer to a really good question. Thank you so much. And like Avi, I had a PhD student from UNT English department, UNT College of Education. He was from, I would say, I think he was from Nigeria. And he was working on his PhD. And he actually took an independent study with me because he wanted to see, he wanted to learn some post-colonial theory because he was working on curriculum development and the imperial nature of it in Nigeria, where not the Europeans, but the dominant ethnic group centers their history as a history of the nation. And we had some wonderful conversations. What would be a good starting point for undergrad students? Well, these conversations that we are having is a good starting point. But there is a good book by Ania Lumba, which I have used, um, which I would recommend as a beginner's book. Any beginner's book. Don't go to these guys, not Bill Ashcraft and others. But Ania Lumba, Laila Gandhi has a good book. Just get a basic introduction to post-colonial studies. Robert Young has a very short introduction to post-colonial studies. And then what you do is you read them. They will invariably always discuss some scholars. There'll be a mention of Said, there'll be a mention of Césaire, there'll be a mention of the Negritude movement, there'll be a mention of Gayatri Spivak, Baba, Marxism. Then you go and read those, right? This is what I call a regressive mode of reading. You pick up an introductory book. The introductory book mentions certain people. You go and read them. They refer to certain people. You go and read them. So by the time you've done the process, you've learned what Said's philosophical basis is. Where does he get his ideas? Who is using Said? How is someone explaining Said? That's the progression that I would highly recommend. Good. So yeah, Hina, if you've read it, that's a good book. Okay, yeah, Anum, thank you for joining us. I was just telling them about one of my hypothetical PhD students who's taking her exams next month and who has read about 280 books. And I was trying to explain what does it take to, become a scholar in a field of study. So thank you for joining us. So which contemporary critics would you say have picked up the strain of thought given by people like, well, every single one. I mean, Spivak, most of her post 1990s work has constantly connected her work to the issues of pedagogy, and Spivak actually, to get her activist credentials and sincerely for so many years, actually went to India, to Bengal, and taught at an elementary school every summer, right? Said, of course, was already committed to the Palestinian cause, right? And constantly worked for first for PLO and then for the Palestinian people. Those of us who do Marxist scholarship already talk about power and how it works. I don't consider myself a major scholar of post-colonial studies, but if you look at my work, I'm already challenging my own assumptions about post-coloniality. So I wouldn't say a single scholar, but pretty much the field itself has incorporated this idea that when we use the term post-colonial, we never really mean that colonialism has ended. Robert Young and his major book on it would be a great example of it. He is one of the major scholars who obviously defines the field and also incorporates Marx in it. Um, so these are some of the people, but 40 years after these articles came in, uh, it is a completely different field of study. It has incorporated feminism, it has incorporated critiques of globalization, it has recaptured or reintegrated its Marxist history. Um, More and more scholars from the so-called periphery have joined us. I mean, the entire 10 volumes of subaltern studies. So increasingly, it's no longer what Arif Dirlik said. It's no longer centered around some main intellectuals present in the West. Majority of our scholars are now coming from the so-called global periphery, and with that, they bring their own modes of reading. Uh, so if you want to go to Africa, if you want to read Ngugi Thiong'o, right, his book Decolonizing the Mind, right, comes from Kenya. Chinwezu's book Decolonizing the African Mind, and there are younger scholars, of course, but these are the established scholars who have already complicated the picture. Deepesh Chakrabarti, Provincializing Europe, is the one who's talking about these history not as a single narrative. Then Partha Chatterjee, we get him from another field, right? Nation and its fragments. Then there are theorists of nationalism who have joined the debates. That's why, like, I find my own approach really, really kind of unfocused, right? Because, I mean, I talk about neoliberalism, write about it, publish about it. I talk about theories of nationalism. How does it work? Who tries to articulate who? What is post-colonial nationalism? Then a part of it is traditional post-colonial theory and post-colonial texts, right? And then going into, if you go by my recent book, of issues of political Islam, right? So I don't even have a single focus, right? But my next forthcoming book, which I'm hoping it is going to be an open access book, is questioning the field of English studies, right? And how to train our students to read Islam inflected texts more carefully and differently. So it depends on what your politics is and where you want to go with it as a scholar. All right. So, I mean, while you're coming up with more questions, to sum up her argument is that she's reading the post in post-colonialism as a temporal marker, right? And what she's saying is, what is the cost of assuming that colonialism is over? And she gives us a whole list of things being done post-colonially within the nations, the acts of occupation and silencing, but also the order of progress developed by American aggression in South America and elsewhere in Africa, in the world, and the use of the military-industrial system, right? And that if you just imagine, if you include America as a post-colonial nation, then what you are taking out of it is, here is a post-colonial nation, which is now also kind of the most aggressive nation on the planet. And that is a critique of empire rights back. We already know that no contemporary or other post-colonialist would ever include the settled colonists as post-colonial, not because they can't claim the title, but because power. We read power. We have read our Foucault, right? And we realize not just the colonial experience, but where can we plot these nations in the current hierarchy of power will also decide whether we include them in post-colonial studies or not. But overall, the field still is not monolithic, right? Depending on where you get your degree, who you study with will decide what post-colonialism is to you, other than a few tropes that Robert Young talks about that are part of the issue. Okay. I have another question. Anum, I think that actually is better and more flexible theory, as Young says that post-colonial theory needs to remain flexible. Why is it important for scholars to select just one? That's really, I have never, that's a really good question. And there is a good explanation of it, why we choose um, that kind of deep specialization. I personally have never tried to do that. I've tried to remain eclectic, but there could be a pragmatic reason to choose one strain of philosophy and others, because then you can have that kind of expertise on it, right? So think of it. I mean, of course, you'll have to study beyond it too, but David Harvey is the biggest name on Marx, right? So what does he have to do for that? Go and read every single thing written by Marx, written about Marx. Read all the challenges to Marx. So that in itself isn't a reductive act, right? It takes that kind of deep research to become David Harvey, right? So maybe that's one reason that people pick up a slice of a period, a time frame, or a scholar so that they can study it deeply. And there are advantages to that. Personally, I have always felt like I couldn't do that. I just, I personally feel because of my life experiences that I cannot give my uncritical loyalty to any single school of thought. So for me, it is always, this is useful to me here. I'm going to use it. I'm going to read up on it. I'm going to find out what are the critiques of this approach, incorporate them in my discussion, and then read it. And that works for me. But another reason scholars choose to focus on one or two schools of thought is because it's easier to master those, right? Then you're within your own territory. You constantly keep building up knowledge. You can develop expertise. You don't have to worry about much else. And, you know, the single author scholars do that, people who study single authors or two authors. I have never thought of, you know, developing an expertise like that. Okay, so we are like going beyond an hour now. Um, so, all right, you're welcome, Anu. So, thank you for joining us. So, this is kind of our third session, The Angel of Progress. I'm pretty sure I have not done justice to it, but my hope is that you will read these essays and have your own opinions about them. The purpose of these meetings is to just kind of initiate you into these debates. Now, next week, same time, we will read Ella Schwartz's essay, you know, When Was the Postcolonial? And that would give us 1, 2, 3 early critiques of postcolonial studies. And we will be, you know, kind of more privy to those debates and what causes them, and why it's important to know it. With Ella Schwartz's essay. And please do watch other videos also. And please also help me in promoting this course, but also other materials so that, you know, more people can use them. All right. Thank you so much. And I will see you next week. Right. And as always, as I say in my videos, you know, peace and love.